You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
If you're interested in diving into your own attachment repair journey and earning security, I invite you to sign up for my free video training called What is Secure Attachment and Do I Have It? You'll learn what attachment theory entails, the defining traits of different attachment strategies, and how to see the warning signs of attachment disturbance across different areas of your life and behavior. Not only that, but you'll glimpse the impact this attachment injury may be having on your relationships, career, and meaningful pursuits. This framework is a helpful starting place, giving you the keys to understanding the root problem and an introduction to the reparative path forward that we offer here at Mettagroup. Head to mettagroup.org/start-here or click the link below to get started. So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is Thursday, February 19th, 2026 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And tonight I thought I would talk about anxious energy, avoidance silence, how different attachment styles or strategies react to uncertainty. We talk about, preoccupied people as being anxious and dismissing people as being detached or avoidant, but actually both of those attachment strategies are driven by abandonment anxiety. You could say all attachment strategies are driven by abandonment anxiety. Disorganized people as well, secure people as well. It is, in fact, that abandonment terror, I like to call it, that drives all attachment behavior. When you feel a threat, your attachment system activates. So what we're really talking about here is the appearance of the activation of attachment strategies across the different attachment types or strategies. Understand that the term attachment strategy comes from the sort of research science side, and attachment styles comes from the social side. The idea of how social relationships work as opposed to how they appear in research around attachment functioning. Secure people, when the attachment system goes off, seeks proximity to people that they know are regulating for that. Then they get regulated, and when the attachment system deactivates, the exploration system activates, and they go back out and explore. And there's always been in the way that those attachment strategies function, that availability of regulating attachment figures, and then the encouragement to go back out and explore. There hasn't been the fundamental interference with the exploration system that happens in the other attachment strategies. If you remember that, the development of the attachment system, when you look at how we all begin, which is avoidant, right? We're all, not avoidant, but auto-regulating. Auto-regulation, of course, is the capacity that avoidant kids have. In the child categories, we have secure, anxious, avoidant, anxious, ambivalent, and disorganized. So that anxiety is a piece of it. It just appears differently. We're born, we're infants, we're swaddled, hopefully, and we are largely self-regulating. If somebody comes reliably enough, we reorient and allow an external source of emotional regulation, but we're dependent on that experience of being regulated externally. And then if somebody comes reliably enough and they provide a consistent kind of regulation, the infant then identifies the strategies for regulating certain kinds of events and learns to provide those regulation strategies for themselves. And it's collaborative in the sense that the child expresses how they and what they need in terms of care, and the caregiver learns from those expressions how to identify what the need is and then to take care of the child in a way that the child can receive. That's the cycle of security, the expression of the child, the empathetic connection, the interpretation of what the child is requesting, and then providing for the child that need. So how do you notice that, right? The child is too hot, and so they fuss in a particular way, and you begin to recognize that when you remove, say, some clothing or remove a blanket, that the child settles. So then you begin to recognize that particular pattern as a request for a certain kind of care, or when they're hungry, or when they're tired. If you've ever been around a small child and the caregiver looks at the way the child is fussing and they say, oh, the child is tired, right? They're recognizing the expression of it. But that would mean that you have a sensitive enough caregiver who pays attention to what the child is expressing and learns to understand the gestures that the child is making, which means they're attentive and sensitively attuned, and then they're resourced to be able to provide the kind of care that the child needs. And then in situations where that doesn't happen, then the child learns something else from the care that they receive. In order for an avoidant child to have developed security, somebody would have had to come reliably enough to move them out of autoregulating. But because nobody comes, that is to say that they're profoundly neglected in childhood. And we would define neglect as a caregiver who's present but unavailable. That is to say, unresponsive to what the child needs. The child grows up to be avoidant. What do we mean by avoidant? They avoid attaching and involving themselves intimately with someone else. When you look at that patterning, what really happens is the child learns to suppress the emotions that arise in response to neglect. And they learn to suppress the attachment system in response to the neglect. So imagine a child whose attachment system activates and nobody comes to help them settle it. It's a distressing experience for a child. And so the child, and this is not obviously a cognitive function, this is a biological function that's built into our capacity as human beings to adapt to the situation that we're in. And that adaptation is the hyper activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which shuts down the emotional system and shuts down the attachment system. What does that mean? The attachment system is off and the exploration system is on, so that they're pretty good explorers. You'll notice in secure children who form an attachment to their caregivers, once they get up on all four and they can crawl, they begin this process of exploring. And that process of exploring includes this constant referencing of the attachment figure so that they feel that they have this reliable, secure base that they can come back to. So that's the thing that supports them. And what you'll notice is a child will crawl a few feet away and turn around and look for the encouragement that they need to keep going. And they'll crawl further away and look around for that reassurance. And they'll crawl out of the door and lose sight of the caregiver and crawl right back in and look for that reassurance. And the more reliable that reassurance is, the freer they are to explore wider and wider spaces around the caregiver, because when they get upset, they can come rushing back and the caregiver will be there and be comforting and soothing to them. And then once they're settled, the caregiver will then encourage them again to explore. But in the childhood of an anxious avoidant, that reassurance isn't there, and it's never really been there. And in that capacity to shut down the attachment system, the exploration system is active, and so they explore, but they explore on their own. There isn't that exchange with the caregiver that would happen with a secure child. A secure child would find something and come rushing back and express to the caregiver the thing that they've discovered. And if they had a sensitive enough caregiver, the caregiver would engage in the receiving of that exploration and uh, offer support and praise for it and encouragement to explore more. But that doesn't really happen for anxious avoidant children. They explore, but they explore on their own, and they don't have that reference to share it with. And in fact, often they grow up in family systems where that isn't really valued particularly. And in order to preserve it, they begin to keep it secret. It's private. And the secondary exploration, the thing that they have to do to be valued in the family, that they do, whether it relates to them in the sense of their own sources of meaning or not. Anxious ambivalent children, so it's ambivalent, right? Back and forth. What really their experiences of care is that it's inconsistent and unpredictable. When it's unpredictable, that also leads to not particularly paying attention to the patterns of experience. Remember, the secure child expresses, the caregiver pays attention and decodes what those expressions are and begins to provide care based on those expressions. So the child learns, if I make this gesture, I get that care, so that really creates this potential for this rapid communication that a child can make with a caregiver, which doesn't really happen with the other attachment strategies. There is no feedback for the avoidant child. They wander around the world really, in some sense, alone. The preoccupied child becomes hypervigilant around the responses of the caregiver because they're chaotic and unpredictable. And in order to get their needs met, they have to iterate over and over again different requests because the caregivers aren't paying attention. They're not sensitively attuned to them. They don't decode the requests that the child makes for a particular type of care, so that the child doesn't learn how to express in a particular way to reliably get their needs met. They just have to keep hectoring the caregiver, and sometimes they get their needs met and sometimes they don't. And it's chaotic, and there isn't a pattern that the child can easily employ for that. Sometimes they get the care that they need, and the delusion for the child is that they think that they asked right, and that's why they got the care. The caregiver, though, isn't paying that kind of attention. They're providing for the child what they think the child should have. But it isn't from the signaling of the child that they do that. It's their internal process that indicates that. Is that making sense? So when we say anxious energy, avoidance, silence, what we're really talking about is that connection that happens between preoccupied adults and dismissing adults. The that constant activity of seeking proximity that preoccupied people do is that anxious energy. And the avoidant, of course, that is keeping all of that internal life private is that that avoidant silence, that um, you almost think that the ideal relationship is where the avoidant person listens and the preoccupied person chatters away, filling the silence. Dismissing people often interpret that forward movement, if it gets too close, as intrusive, and so they're setting up and maintaining a distance, um, distancing, you might say. How does that actually work? Because the dismissing person suppresses awareness of their emotions, they don't actively regulate them through the conscious self experience. Doesn't mean that they don't have emotions, that they don't need to be regulated. It means that there isn't a conscious awareness of that. And they don't have conscious emotional regulation skills in the same way that uh, other attachment strategies might have. Preoccupied people get enmeshed in the mind states of other people. Uh, and there's a reversal of the empathetic experience and their own emotional experience. And the empathetic experience of the other person becomes the dominant emotional experience for preoccupied people. And so what they do is engage in the emotional regulation of the uh, dismissing person. And because they've inverted the uh, empathetic experience and their own emotional experience, when the dismissing person is regulated, they feel regulated. So it's one of the reasons that there's so much push for physical proximity to the partner is because of that reversal. If you're familiar with your Winnicott theory around exploration, what he would say is that the capacity for exploration opens in that protected space for the child, between the child and the caregiver. That's the space that we need in order to learn to explore uh, for purpose, for meaning. And so you'll notice in secure people that that space is always open for them, and they've always been able to attend to understanding what's purposeful, what's meaningful to them. And that insecure and disorganized people often do not have that experience. And so they become more oriented around secondary exploration. So the gathering of time, energy, and resources. In our culture, of course, this is quite class dependent. Um, in order to gather enough time, energy, and resources that you can actually fully fund your primary exploration will also depend on what opportunities are available to you. In the United States, of course, the educational system is really class dependent. And if you're not in the upper middle class, you're at a distinct disadvantage for that. Um, we don't really have much of a middle class left because of the transference of resources and the extreme inequality of our society. And one of the ways that was achieved was by gutting the public education system that used to really be able to offer a pathway into more more affluence. But even uh, uh, I went to school, given my age, at the right in the height of the post World War II boom, and even then the the surveys that people were doing about the educational system suggested that it didn't really offer you a possibility for education above the education level in your family system. so that there is that um, difficulty in our culture. Um, if you were bright and you got lucky in that system, you were able to move up, and it was uh, ordinary to hear of people who were the first in their generation to go to college. And I think that it's probably ordinary now, but less common. Um, and since we've instituted in our country this system of debting for students, uh, it was not available when I went to school, right? So 50 years ago or so wasn't necessary. And then, in some sense, the invention of that system um, uh, was really a way of regressing the forward social momentum. The problem with disorganization, of course, and with those kinds of societal functions is that poverty is so highly correlated with disorganization. You'd almost think that it was a cause of uh, disorganized attachment. But in disorganized attachment, the which is really like falling off a cliff for functionality, the aspect of that anxious energy is so extreme, and then the silences of the hard shutdowns that are ordinary in that category. The defining characteristic of disorganization, of course, is dissociation. And dissociation really interferes quite a bit with um, your capacity to form uh, intimate, reliable relationships. But it is still subject to the class system that you're born into, even in upper middle class or wealthy families. The, the family resources can cover for that, and you still have a different kind of opportunity. So, what do you do? I guess that's always the question. Okay, it happened. I'm completely fucked up. What do I do now? So we begin this journey. What I like about this particular journey of attachment repair is that it can be quite accessible. Um, Obviously, in anything that to do with mental health in our society is largely private paid. So we're in that jam. We really don't afford. Um, you might even say we really don't like children in our society because we treat them so badly. I mean, it's shocking when you understand what it is that a child needs in order to thrive and how little of that we're willing to do as a society. Uh, how little infrastructure there is for that. Uh, just appalling, really. Um, so, if you didn't get it as a child, then what we need to be doing is beginning to provide it now. Often, how I like to describe it is a kind of skills training that we need to get into. And one of the things about the different attachment strategies is because the cause of the different attachment strategies is both an overabundance of a certain kind of care and an absence of another kind of care, is we need to begin to develop the skill set where we have a deficit, but at the same time, we need to begin to pull back on the skills that we're over relying on. And in the uh, Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy modeling that comes out of the Tavistock Clinic in London, If you remember, that was the Anna Freud side of things, not the Melanie Klein side of things. Um, the dimensions of early mentalizing, spontaneity versus monitoring, self versus other, internal versus external, cognitive versus affective. Dismissing people over monitor, and they're very self-oriented. They're very internally oriented, and they're very cognitive. Remember that the thing that they learned to do to stabilize the experience of being profoundly neglected in childhood was suppress awareness of their emotions. They don't have that information, which means the cognitive side is dominant in that dimension of cognitive versus affective or emotional. Because empathy is an emotional experience and they suppress awareness of it, they're also not particularly empathetic. So when they're organizing toward collecting information, they don't connect other people empathetically and they don't read them emotionally. So there isn't a need to gather that information from other people. They look at them in a teleological way and map them, or they elicit information from them. They don't need to connect empathetically to them. And so they orient around themselves, and they orient around the working models that they create of themselves and others um, internally. So that gives them that mapping. Preoccupied people, on the other hand, are almost the mirror opposite of that. They're very spontaneous, but they don't monitor. Whereas the dismissing person really needs to monitor things well to understand what's happening and to be able to provide an idealized version of that. Preoccupied people, because of the inconsistency and the chaotic nature of their caregivers, just need to keep asking for the things that they need. Hectoring. You've probably seen a small child asking, 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 the caregiver saying no, no, no. And then finally, after asking enough, the caregiver relents and says yes to get the kid to stop asking. So there's no no in that constellation. And what they learn is you just keep asking and eventually you get what you need. Um, but there's no pattern in the way that that happens. They don't need to monitor it. They're very other oriented because they have to keep reading the other person and feeling into them to understand how to ask for the thing that they want. And they lose track of themselves in that process. And because they're good at regulating the other person as one of the means of exchange, uh, they're oriented toward that empathetic experience over their own emotional experience. They're very other oriented because that teleological appearance of the other person really informs how they ask for it. And they're very emotional without that cognitive aspect because the cognitive was never a pathway to getting what they want. I like to say you take that pattern of over monitoring self, internal, and cognitive, and you add it to the preoccupied uh, spontaneity, other orientation, external orientation, and emotional entertainment. One plus one equals one. That's the relational dynamic there. Disorganized people, depending on what the disorganization is an uber version of that in some sense. Fearfully preoccupied people, it's an extreme form of preoccupation. Fearful avoidant people are different in some ways. They don't suppress their emotions, they just reserve their emotions. They have a much richer emotional life than a organized, dismissing person has. But both the fearfully preoccupied and fearfully avoidant people are driven by this intense anxiety about the world being a place of harm. And the extreme version of disorganization is a complexly disorganized person who uses sometimes secure responses, sometimes dismissing responses, sometimes preoccupied responses. And so any pattern of that mentalizing map that I described before could apply to them in different moments. So it's really hard to predict how they might respond. In relationships, of course, what you want from somebody else is a predictability in how they're going to respond. And the reason for that is that you can then understand how to say something to them and anticipate how they're going to respond based on how you present it. Is that making sense? So that modeling of that secure functioning, you understand the meaning that you give to something. This approach is very different from, say, a typical psychoanalytic or psychotherapy approach. The ego, superego, the id, as a constellation. Here we're talking about, and this is the Buddhist modeling of that, the capacity to sense something meets the object to be sensed, consciousness of the sensing experience arises. All of this is not known to the self-experience or the witnessing self-experience. That witnessing self-experience is, you might say, is equivalent to the ego. That sensing experience, so the gathering of the sensing experience is also different. In the East, in the Buddhist constellation of mind, the mind, which is the sixth sense, so touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling are the traditional Western five, and you add to that mind. Mind is the thing that directs your attention, but also directs the process of meaning. In the constellation of Western psychoanalytic thought, for instance, is the real, the imaginary, and the symbol. The symbolism of things is how things are represented. Here, in this Buddhist way of thinking, the sensing experience is gathered by mind directing your attention based on things that you prefer, leaving out things that you don't like. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? And you form this queue of mind moments, these snapshots of sensing experience, which are then compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a meaning in the perceptual database, the whole meaning thread attaches to the present moment. So we live in not a world of what's really happening, but in the world of meaning that we assign to it in some ways. A combination of the imaginary and the symbolism that we assign. But that meaning is often related to experiences that we've had and assigned meaning to. And because there is this whole meaning thread that attaches, and the mind tends to categorize for memory, in similarly defined experiences, that present moment experience that we have is inhabited by the whole succession of the past, where we've categorized it in the same way. And in addition to that, because one of the processes of making meaning, as it's understood in this model, is the response to the conditions of the present moment and our anticipation of what will happen in response to that. So in some sense, we're inhabiting the experience of meaning in the present moment, which is defined by all of the past experiences of this kind of experience, plus the anticipation of what might happen in response to an action that we would take because of our understanding of it. Is that making sense? So we live in this world of meaning that is all three, the past, the present, and also the future. If you were to be in balance and open, uh, not confined by the limited identity, that self, that conscious experience of self that we know, uh, in that moment of beingness, what would open in front of you are all of the possibilities that you could choose from. So we really talk about it in the Buddhist modeling of this, of shifting out of the limited identity of self into the expansive nature of self, which then could uh, experience all of the potential choices that are there and then begin to choose the ones that are more meaningful. Whereas when we get restricted into the identity around that small self or that limited self, we tend to pick over and over again habitually representations that have happened to us before that we feel a sense of safety in choosing. We would call that samsara, the repetition, um, to pick over and over again the outcomes that we know, even though in front of us might be a myriad of choices that would be better for us. Is that making sense? So, in this way of working, what we're talking about really is coming out of that confinement of the limited identity and moving into the expansive uh, activity of self. Uh, Dan Brown used to call it the Danness, or if I were to call it of myself, the Georgeness, or uh, each of you. What is that activity of you, and shifting out of the identification as the limited identity being the source of all of those choices, and really understanding it as the witnessing capacity to look and see what choices you're making, right? And when we begin to do this attachment repair work, we're really pushing into opening that sensitivity to watching what we do rather than imagining that the conscious self experience is the author of what we do. In order to change the conditioning that causes these patterns of choice to differ, we need to affect the unconscious process, not necessarily the conscious process. In fact, changing the conscious process doesn't change that much the automatic responses. Is that making sense? So, what we begin to do is engage in these processes that allow the unconscious mind, the unconscious activity of who you are to choose differently. And that is really about these representations that we make. The ideal parent figure protocol is a visualization process that changes it, which has its roots in the Mahamudra practice of the Vajrayana Tibetan meditation practices, and is quite effective in layering in alternatives to the conditioned response. I like to say that this is not different than the ordinary experience of making meaning that you've always employed, because if you don't have meaning, you don't have an experience that maps on closely enough to the spontaneous arising of the present moment, the imagination has always been there to create and define the experience of the present moment. So if you're like me and you like novel experiences and you're always trying to find a way to go and do something where there isn't already that whole elaboration, that it then becomes this fresh experience, then you will know that if you don't have the capacity, you don't already have the defined the definitions, then the mind begins to make meaning out of it. In these ruts of samsara, these grooves that we get into, we begin to associate alternatives to the things that happen to us. So, uh, in early childhood, of course, we begin to create these working models of ourselves and these working models of other people based on our interaction with them. If you have a caregiver that delights in you and is resourced and capable, and your needs as an infant and a child do not overwhelm them, and they're just happy to provide for you the things that you need, you build a working model of yourself as somebody who's delightful, whose needs are reasonable, who can get what they want from the world, and you go about the world as if that's how it is, because that's the working model that you have. And if you grew up, I laugh because it's such a foreign concept for the way I grew up. But if you grew up in a household where your caregiver was completely overwhelmed and couldn't provide for you, you grow up thinking that you're not worthy of having care, and you think that you're needy and that your demands are outrageous and completely unfulfillable, even though the demands that you made on your caregivers were the demands that any infant would have made on them, right? It isn't, and until we can really um, normalize that to see that actually our needs weren't outrageous, it's we had an under-resourced caregiver who couldn't provide it. To see that clearly, so we can change our mind about the kinds of care that we need to find for ourselves now. Yes, that's a terrible sadness. So, using the ideal parent figure protocol, we visualize alternatives to the things that happen to us, uh, uh, in some sense, ideal alternatives, so that when the mind goes into the database to collect a meaning to attach to the present moment, it attaches a meaning that our demands are reasonable, and we can have an expectation that they can be met, so that when we create reality, we create a future where that possibility is there. Whereas in the using the old definitions, in that process of creating the experience of reality, if we create the perception that our needs will not be met, we often don't even try to get them met. We don't even inquire about it because we're convinced in some ways. I like to call it self-rejecting. We save ourselves the pain of being rejected by doing it ourselves. We save ourselves the humiliation by humiliating ourselves. We did.
Yeah, with in that context, we are talking about fear of success, I think the
Yeah.
last week. Why is that maybe in the preoccupied stance that the positive feelings which might come with IPF is not followed through in that sense? I've seen it's almost like you're letting go of the good, supportive parents the next day. I almost like I'm forgetting, this is a good, trustworthy meditation I had, but in the sense next day you almost like go back to helplessness. Um,
Right.
and I wonder why that is, even though it is good for the mind and the body, then the self feels pretty great. Why isn't it naturally inclining towards it again? Is it because it's not practiced enough? But
The
or is it just a
so
known
fear of
aspect?
success is related to exploration. So it really depends, and any of the attachment strategies can have uh, fear of success. It just depends on how your early forays into learning to explore were met by the caregiver. Dismissing people tend to be good at secondary exploration and not as good at primary exploration, and so they limit their primary exploration and pursue secondary exploration. So they get very good at secondary exploration. But when it comes time to shift into the meaningfulness of something as opposed to the gathering of time, energy, and resources so that you can transact for care, that's when it would be more likely to pop up, that thing. And what happens to a child who develops fear of success is that when they attempt to succeed at something that's really meaningful to them, if the caregiver interferes with that, and what they mainly do is interfere by withdrawing affection, the child begins to associate succeeding with the loss of affection. So that it's very often, and this is, you mainly see the pattern of this in uh, disorganized people. There's a lot of beginnings, right? And some beginnings, because the anxiety is low at the beginning. You're not close to succeeding. And then you move into the middle, and all of a sudden the anxiety of succeeding begins to arise. And the closer you get to actually finishing and getting the reward, the more the anxiety of abandonment arises. That if you succeed in doing that, you'll be, you'll lose the attention and concern of the people that are close to you. Now,
Because
mhm.
because the caregiver started distancing from the child.
Right. So if you look at the dismissing child, when the dismissing child pursued the things that really mattered to them, they were steered into things that mattered to the caregiver.
Hmm.
And if they insisted and pushed into doing the things that really mattered to them, the caregiver, the response of the caregivers would be more and more severe in terms of withdrawal and lack of support. And sometimes there's a compromise where the dismissing child learns to balance and perform for the caregiver, and and then have a secret life on their own. So what's coming to mind is a description of a woman who wore a very prim and proper attire and then changed on the bus into the clothes that she wanted to wear at school, and then changed back and showed up again in the prim and proper attire. Um, but
It's
there was always
the withdrawal from the
Mhm.
caregiver is not during success or when success is about to happen. The withdrawal is there all the time. Isn't it's they're consistently withdrawing, right?
It depends on, dismissing. To grow up to be dismissing means you had consistent care that was withdrawing, right? Neglecting. But in a preoccupied household, that isn't what happens. It's completely unpredictable. But remember in that the description of the space that opens up between the caregiver and the child. The caregiver protects the child and creates a safe space for the child. So the child does not have to be hypervigilant about the environment. And this doesn't really happen for kids who grow up to be preoccupied. They're always in a state of vigilance around the environment. And so that safe creative space never really opens for them. So they never really learn to explore. If the caregiver demands an excellence in something, that the child will provide the excellence, but it won't be associated with the primary exploration and that primary exploration. So the skill set isn't there to pursue the primary exploration, and also it may be very anxiety provoking for the adult. to attempt to pursue things that are meaningful. The preoccupied person really most often takes a supportive position in supporting somebody else's exploration because they're directed what to do, and they don't have to come up with the direction or the pursuit that they have to do. They fall in line with somebody else's. I notice that quite a bit in the tech world. The very upper level of the tech world is creative and directional, and the whole middle part is supporting that vision without really much in the way of input as to what direction you're headed in.
I knew they were good at following, but now I'm realizing they're also good at supporting, which I didn't
Right.
realize that was true. Why would that be the case? Why would support?
Because it's a way of eliciting proximity from the person that they need proximity to. In
I mean,
fact,
they can be also physically very affectionate, right? That's the true because by being physical affectionate to others, they get physical affection back from others.
preoccupied people, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, you look at the one of the things that's very typical of preoccupied people is to trade sex for proximity, right? And the because they're drawing on somebody else's sexual desire for them or their sexual compliance to seek the proximity they want. But because the motivation is not sexual pleasure, it creates a difficulty in the sexual exchange, which is often apparent. Um, Dismissing people because they're um, neglected, they also have difficulty with sexual encounters because they don't like to be touched, and they weren't physically cared for enough, and so they often have trouble with the physicality of sex. So they for instance, choose positions which limit the physical touch, whereas the preoccupied person might like to be belly to belly. The dismissing person can't stand the belly to belly. They can't. You know how? Have you ever hugged somebody? Do you know the people that hug that chest to chest, belly to belly is sort of the hug? That's the best way to get that physical contact that's emotionally relieving. And it's unusual, I think, at least my experience of hugging people, to find somebody who can do that without feeling self-conscious or limiting a bit. The homophobia, of course, in our culture is pretty extreme. Two men to hug belly to belly, chest to chest, raises immediate concerns. So it's some kind of wishbone effect, one shoulder touching one shoulder with as much space between the genitals as possible and still be in contact and not fall over. Women, it's a little different.
So trading sex with physical proximity, I thought asking directly for physical proximity is much easier than asking for sex. Why won't a preoccupied person simply ask for a hug?
No, they're offering sex for proximity. And you're right, it can be more difficult to get uh, physical proximity. How long can you get somebody to hold you? Right.
Oh, I see. You're saying that's not enough for the physical for the preoccupied person.
Right. So if you want somebody to actually engage you physically for a longer period of than the few seconds of a hug, then that
Oh, I see.
is a better offer. And then also to interfere with sexual gratification in the relationship so that it goes on even longer is one of the things that often happens. Uh, so, sex is difficult enough. Men are delicate flowers. Anything can interfere with the erection. Thank God we have Cialis. Uh, So just to complete the thought on what to do, one of the great things, one of the just astonishing things about the time that we're living in, which has never really happened before, is that there's a way of repairing attachment conditioning, earning security, and relieving that constant level of abandonment anxiety that's associated with insecure and disorganized attachment. It is possible to do it. Um, and there's, even a few avenues to do it. In our in our path, a meditation path, really is centered in using the meditation approach to develop the mentalizing and emotional clarity and regulations skills that you need. The psychoeducation around how secure relationships are supposed to function is also important, because if you grow up in insecure and disorganized family systems, you don't know how secure relationships are supposed to function. What you see and understand is how insecure and disorganized relationships are supposed to function. And when you attempt to create or recreate those relationships, that's what happens. So then learning the skill set. I would say that insecure, so dismissing adults and preoccupied adults who are organized, can begin to negotiate secure functioning relationships in existing relationships. But I sometimes think that disorganized people should, you hear the word should, I would recommend that you begin to work through the dissociation first, so that when you enter into secure functioning relationships, you're able to be reliable. The thing that really prevents disorganized people, dissociative people, from being embraced by the secure functioning community is the reliability question. And so as long as dissociation remains the primary means of emotional regulation, it's hard to show up at a clip that's reliable enough that you would be welcomed in that community. So that's what I would suggest. What do you say we do a little meditation? What would you like to do? Now, let the scene fade. Finding your way out of there, I'll count from 5 to 1. When I reach 1, you'll be fully present, fully awake. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fully awake, settle in the experience. How's that? Good. So what's coming up? Tomorrow, we're starting a new level 2 on Friday mornings. On Saturday, we have the second of the level 1 attachment. Sorry, level 1 in addiction class. So there's 2 more of those. On the 27th, we have Kaleidoscope. We had our workshop, actually was pretty good. So if you're curious about any of that, it's on the website. Take a look. I offer the teaching freely, but I hope that if you can, you'll make a donation. There's a link on the website to do that. Really good to see you. Really good to practice with you. I hope to see you again soon. I know. If you're struggling with addiction or have in the past, I invite you to check out my free video on how to heal from addiction. You'll learn about the distinct attachment repair approach to addiction recovery that we offer here at Mettagroup, and how this approach differs from other forms of addiction support like 12-step programs, rehab, or even therapy. If you're finding that persistent anger, frustration, resentment, and shame consume your life, or you're stuck in dysfunctional cycles that keep your life small, then check out this resource. If you struggle with substance abuse or process addiction, this is for you. Sign up for free at mettagroup.org/addiction or head to the link below.